Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And today I'm going to be looking about questions about how ordinary Americans viewed the world in 1945. We've looked at the changes in America domestically after the Second World War into the 50s and 60s, but what ordinary American people felt about the nature of the world, about foreign relations and America's role internationally has been kind of less explored. So, at the end of the Second World War, there had been a dramatic change in America's traditional foreign relations, foreign policy, as a result of the kind of the unprecedented nature of the war. The devastation of the Axis powers, which took a couple of decades to recover, gave America an unparalleled economic head start. If you imagine that not only were Germany and Japan physically devastated by the war, but France and Britain were financially crippled, and their abilities to operate as kind of imperial metropoles fundamentally undermined for the rest of the post-war era. And so America had really every card to play. And indeed, the Soviet Union, which emerged as a rival superpower at the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War, was certainly not an economic superpower. It too had been economically devastated and physically devastated to an extent that no other nation was, though countries like Poland and China came in for some stiff competition. Some 27 million Russians had died during the war, and the only power that actually emerged stronger at the end of the war is the USA. And few Americans at the end of the war really appreciated what this meant and what role America would play in the world in the 50s, 60s and 70s. The major policymakers didn't really discuss about the idea of a Pax Americana, that America being essentially the home of the centre of the world system in the post-war era. James Patterson in Grand Expectations writes, top policymakers at first did not talk much about Pax Americana, about worldwide communist expansion, or even about the American century that Henry Luce had anticipated in 1941. But it was obvious that the advances in air power, rocketry, atomic weapons ended America's history of relatively free security, and that the United States might have to fill at least part of the post-war power vacuum. Most political leaders recognised that they lived on an interconnected planet in which the spark in one corner of the world could ignite explosions in many other corners. America, Secretary of War Stimson observed, could never again be an island to itself. No private program and no public policy in any sector of our national life can now escape from the compelling fact that if it is not framed within the reference of the world, it is framed with perfect futility. So you have a population that was largely as insular in 1945 as it had been in 1941. A population whose tendency to retreat back into isolationist thinking was always present. And that was now contrasted by a political elite that saw the world in very different ways. The existence of atomic weapons, rocketry, and the means to guide it towards America, the existence of air power, meant that America could no longer rely on the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans to keep it safe. The world had got a lot smaller, and throughout the 50s and 60s would get smaller still as advances in nuclear weapons continued unabated. After 1945, the American policy-making elites in Washington were shaped by the view that America had lost many of its traditional isolationist advantages. The events after 1945 would be brought home to the American public in quite an abrupt way. Many of the scares and the panics of the 1950s, from the Truman and Eisenhower anti-communist periods and the rise of McCarthyism, were really a representation of an increasingly anxious American public who ideally would have not wanted to engage with the outside world, but new means of communication, particularly the advent of television and the fall of many countries to communism around the world, meant that ordinary Americans were unable to simply ignore the rest of the world. And the threat of the advance of communism and the acquisition of nuclear weapons by the Soviet Union made it more and more likely that the reluctance of America to deal with fundamental foreign policy questions would translate into a panic when these foreign policy questions don't go away. America, that had a relatively small army in 1939, with almost no intelligence service, had to develop very, very quickly the means of fighting global wars, fighting in Asia, fighting in Europe, having the complexities of things like code breaking, intelligence, none of which existed in 1939, and had to then adapt this to the new quasi-peacetime, quasi-wartime conditions of the Cold War, where huge standing armies had to be maintained, huge arsenals of weapons. And as we've already explored, Truman needed to develop a new intelligence system, a new way of informing the presidency about what was going on in the world, and this emerged partly through conspiracy, partly through blunder, as the largely unchecked and over-budgeted CIA. Of course, in 1945, there was no real need to feel insecure or afraid in America at all. America had military outposts around the world, fleets of bombers that could raise cities to the ground, and it had nuclear weapons. It faced virtually no threat from the Soviet Union, unlike much of Western Europe, which certainly did. But it was the feeling that circumstances could so rapidly change that left many Americans feeling unsure and fearful. And there was a fear that communism might spread not so much through military force, but perhaps in some mysterious way through subversion. There were all manner of anxieties about who in the State Department had been talking to the Russians, how friendly they had been with them during the Second World War, how close those ties had been, and how close those relationships had been. And in some cases, yes, there had been spies in the State Department. There had been information passed back and forth. How much of this had the official sanction of Roosevelt as a back channel to the Soviets? It's unclear. What was also unclear was the extent to which American citizens would support any further major military action overseas, and how much America becoming involved in the affairs of countries from Greece to Korea would be tolerated. The decision by Truman to announce the Truman Doctrine is a case in point. The Truman Doctrine was really the product of an American miscalculation about Great Britain. in 1945 when John Maynard Keynes came to America to negotiate what he hoped would be a gift of money to the British economy in order to help the British deal with an adjustment to peacetime and to deal with their huge wartime debts. What he wound up was a loan. The loan was smaller than Keynes had hoped for, and it came with some serious conditions attached to it, one of which was the full convertibility of the British currency of the pound in 1947. The pound's convertibility meant that the weak British economy could see outflows of cash leaving as investors moved their money overseas and particularly to America, and would see a collapse in the value of the pound. This, when it does happen in 1947, leads to a virtual collapse in the British economy. It leads to the beginnings of post-war austerity and the problem of rationing has to be kept up until the mid-1950s as a result. The thing that the British can't do as the pound slumps is project itself as an imperial power, and it can't carry on propping up the struggle against communism in Greece. Between 1945 and 1947, there was every expectation that the British would take on a leading role in the fight against world communism. But with the British economy fatally undermined, they can't do this any longer. In some ways, a more honest view was that the British economy had been living on borrowed time for far too long, and currency controls had artificially propped it up, and that what America had done really had been to reveal the true nature of the British economy. But that doesn't help when you're having to fund the Greek army and train it and equip it against militants fighting all over the country. So with the fear that Greece was going to fall to communism and perhaps Turkey alongside it, thus putting the communist flags on the Mediterranean along with Tito's Yugoslavia in the Aegean and the Adriatic, there was intense alarm by the Truman administration that the Mediterranean might be cut off from oil exports from the Middle East. All that needed to happen was perhaps North Africa to fall to communism, and then oil could be shut off. Truman came to immensely regret not helping Britain later on, and he saw the convertibility crisis as an avoidable blunder. Because what it meant was that now America would have to step into the breach that the British had been forced to abandon. The decolonisation of India and the abandonment of Palestine were other parts of the speed up of the British timetable to leave empire. The Truman Doctrine was something ideally Truman himself would not necessarily have gone for. It was a measure that meant that complicated, difficult and alarming foreign policy challenges once again had to be pitched to a rather reluctant US population, and Truman had to present it to America as an unavoidable task, that if communism wasn't stopped, communism might come to America's borders one day. That this was probably highly unlikely was neither here nor there. Communism had to be stopped, in Truman's view, to prevent world markets from falling to communist countries, or at least world markets from being falling not so necessarily to communism, but to national liberation movements. James Patterson writes revealingly about the perspective of America's foreign policy elites, particularly when it came to being at odds with the views of the population. Notwithstanding these feelings of insecurity, which were especially obvious in the immediate aftermath of the war. The leaders of America's post-war foreign policy, a group that came to be known as the establishment, developed a self-confidence that occasionally bordered on self-righteousness. Their rising certitude rested upon the belief that the Soviet Union was a dangerous foe, and that the United States had a large interest in the world, that it must assert these interests strongly. Appeasement led inevitably to disgrace and defeat. Leaders of the establishment did not always define these interests clearly. Where indeed must the United States risk war? But they were confident that America possessed the economic and military resources to outlast and ultimately to overcome a host of potential enemies. In their approach to international relations, they developed very grand expectations, and they managed to fashion into official American policy. Now, what's revealing from there is the fear of appeasement. The the story of appeasement of Neville Chamberlain and Hitler has gradually translated from being a British to a kind of an Anglo-American myth. The American decision-making throughout the Cold War, all the way into kind of various aspects of the post-Cold War period, has been based on this obsession with Munich in 1938. That if you appease the enemy at all, if you negotiate at all, then what will happen is simply you'll have to fight the war that you could have fought in a much more advantageous position further down the line when it's far, far harder and the costs are going to be far, far higher. The idea that there is any kind of nuance in looking at Munich in 1938 and that Chamberlain might not have been quite the fool that he's portrayed to be is very often sort of swept out of the way. And appeasement has been used to justify most of the kind of the more belligerent foreign policy positions, and it has become a kind of an almost parable of folly that one must never ever do anything that might be conceived as appeasing a dictator. However, in the late 1940s, this was understandable. The world had recently seen the end of a war that had killed in excess of 50 million people, and it appeared to have been triggered by appeasement itself. And so it kind of makes sense that this would have been at the forefront of American foreign policy thinking. But what's also present is this idea that America had interests in the world that must be protected, that America had 5% of the world's population and half the world's wealth in 1945, and that everything possible should be employed to keep things that way. Much of the world's wealth flowed to America through quasi-imperial relations, the ability of America to be the world's economic powerhouse, the world's banker, and the world's creditor, was also matched by the ability of America to afford commodities at prices which were advantageous. So rubber from Malaya and pineapples and sugar and tobacco from Cuba, for example. So American industry benefited immensely by having stable sources of resources which could be purchased at rock bottom prices, and the disruption that communism presented to all of this was a key reason for America becoming a far greater imperium in the post-war era than it had been prior to the war. When Roosevelt died, Harry Truman struck a far more kind of belligerent tone with the Soviets. Now, it's not to suggest that Roosevelt was soft on the Soviet Union and that Truman was the hard-headed pragmatist, Roosevelt had all sorts of suspicions about Stalin, but seemed on some level to be able to give Stalin the greater benefit of the doubt, and was perhaps a more kind of genial character when it came to meeting people like Molotov. Stalin seemed to actually quite like Roosevelt, and saw them as the two figures that would reshape the world together, the two great statesmen. The truth of the matter, revealed by George Kennan in his long telegram, and Averell Harriman, who had been America's ambassador to the Soviet Union, was that the Soviets were unwilling to play by any of the rules agreed notionally between Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt at the wartime conferences. Averell Harriman in 1944 said, "Unless we take issue with the present policy, there's every indication that the Soviet Union will become a world bully wherever their interests are involved." The immediate post-war era saw the Soviets undermine and break any promises made in the Eastern Zone, Soviet zone in Germany, in Manchuria, Iran, in Turkey, on the Dardanelles, and their own policy towards even Western Europe become curiously ambiguous. Roosevelt said, "Averell is right. We can't do business with Stalin." This is 3 weeks before his death. He's broken every one of the promises he made at Yalta. But how, at the same time, Roosevelt refused to say much of this in public. He refused to actually really challenge Stalin. And it becomes difficult to imagine precisely what Roosevelt would have done had he lived any longer. So perhaps it was Roosevelt's poor health, perhaps it was his realization that Stalin had really manipulated him in the dying moments of his life, that caused him to reflect like this. But there was, in the American population in general and in the American media, a dramatic shift towards the right from 1944 onwards, and a growth, not from a kind of a top level, but a real kind of grassroots growth in anti-communism and the suspicion of the communists. Perhaps it was because anti-fascism had become redundant from 1944 onwards, when it was clear that Nazism had been or was about to be imminently defeated, that new fears about the security of America and about the future of America in a very uncertain world began to take root. The horrors of Nazism were revealed at the end of the war, bit by bit. The British and American populations, Western populations, didn't fully embrace or fully kind of realise the horrors of Nazism for quite some time, and the realities of the camps were not kind of at the forefront of the debate about Nazism, perhaps for at least another 20 years. But the threat of the Soviets becomes gradually more apparent throughout this period of time to mainstream America, and the understanding of what communism was not kind of widespread, except that it was something that was contrary to American values and largely un-American and alien. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting, and we'll continue with this in due course. Do remember to check out our Patreon page if you can, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Thanks, all the best, bye-bye.